My name is Emma Taylor. I'm 37 years old, and the moment I stepped into that dining room, I knew I'd made a mistake. Not because I looked out of place, or even because I didn't belong, but because for a brief second I thought maybe they'd changed. The room was all crystal and polish, polished voices, polished judgments. My sister looked up from her glass of Sauvignon Blanc and, without even pretending to hide it, said in front of everyone, "Well, the dropout farmer made it. Did you bring kale cookies for dessert?" The laughter that followed didn't feel like teasing. It felt like being pushed outside of a circle I was born into. My uncle leaned over to my father and muttered something that wasn't meant for me to hear. "Still playing with plants. What a waste of a Stanford brain." My father didn't blink. He just adjusted his cufflinks and said, "Let her have her dirt. Every family needs a cautionary tale." They raised their glasses like it was a toast. To my failure. Nobody asked about my company. Nobody brought up the drought years or the community gardens we had helped fund across 4 states. Nobody mentioned that the product I built with my bare hands had helped farmers keep their land when subsidies failed. They didn't say my name once. I sat at a table where I'd once dreamed of being honored. Now I was just decoration, or maybe a warning. I stared down at my untouched wine glass and tried to hold my breath steady. I'd trained myself not to cry in public years ago, especially not in front of them. But that night, something different broke through. My phone buzzed on my lap. I glanced down. It was Riley, my assistant. Her voice played in my ear like oxygen after drowning. "Emma Delilah Forbes just called. You're Entrepreneur of the Year. You're on the cover. It's live." I didn't speak. I didn't move. I just placed my napkin slowly on the side of my plate and looked around that glittering room. The room where no one had asked me a single question. And it hit me. They hadn't forgotten who I was. They never cared to learn. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was free. Because sometimes the sweetest victory isn't revenge. It's realizing you bloomed in the very soil they tried to bury you in. And that was the moment everything started to change. I grew up in a house where silence was considered strength, and being right mattered more than being kind. My father was a federal judge with a voice that could silence a courtroom, and my mother taught constitutional law like it was a sacred text. My brother learned Latin before middle school, and my sister could diagram federal court cases while painting her nails. I liked worms. I spent hours in the backyard with a plastic magnifying glass and a shoebox labeled Soil Lab. I talked to beetles like they were professors, and once cried when my father paved over my favorite patch of dandelions. They didn't mean to leave me out, but they also didn't know what to do with a girl who collected compost instead of awards. At Sunday dinners, while my siblings debated law reviews, I kept quiet and passed the bread, hoping no one would ask what I was reading. It was never the right answer. When I brought home a science fair ribbon for a project on sustainable irrigation, my mother smiled thinly and said, "That's very practical." Then she hung my sister's Model UN certificate right above it. I remember staring up at the wall and realizing it wasn't just about winning. It was about winning the right way. By high school, I had learned how to be smaller. I joined debate team not because I loved it, but because I thought maybe they'd see me differently. I wore blazers to family brunches and memorized court rulings like lullabies. But nothing I did ever lit up their eyes the way Daniel's first internship in the Capitol did. I wasn't rebellious. I was careful. I wanted them to see me, really see me. But it felt like trying to paint myself in colors they liked while scrubbing off the ones that made me whole. So I hid things. My sketchbooks filled with garden layouts, my seed experiments under the bed, even my dreams. I told them I wanted to be a lawyer. What I meant was I didn't want to lose them. That's the thing about growing up in a house full of sharp minds. You start to believe the soft parts of yourself are mistakes. But even then, deep down, something in me kept growing. Quietly, rooted in silence, but stubborn enough to wait for the light. By my final semester at Yale Law, I had a job offer waiting at a top DC firm and 3 professors pushing me toward a federal clerkship. Everything was on track. Everything except me. That spring, I took a legal externship in a rural Virginia county. It was supposed to be about land use policy. What I saw instead was acres of scorched earth, dried out corn stalks, and a man named Roy, who had stopped speaking after watching 3 straight harvests fail. He gave me a tour of what used to be his farm. There were no lawsuits or regulations that could undo that kind of loss. 2 days after I returned to campus, I got the call that he'd taken his own life. That night, I sat on my dorm floor staring at legal briefs I couldn't finish and started sketching a soil sensor with a ballpoint pen. I didn't even know if it was possible. I just knew I couldn't keep pretending that I cared more about precedent than people. 3 weeks later, I withdrew from Yale. The reaction from my family was immediate and cold. My father didn't argue. He simply folded his newspaper and said, "If you want to live like a farmer, go dig your own field." My mother cried in the kitchen in front of guests and said I'd been radicalized. My brother posted a meme about me going full crunchy granola on his social media. My name disappeared from the family scholarship board within a week. They didn't just disapprove, they erased me. I packed my things, bought a one-way ticket, and found a $300 a month shack behind a feed store in Kansas. It was tiny, drafty, and filled with spiders. But it was mine. I slept on a borrowed futon with code notes pinned to the wall. I read open source engineering forums and taught myself how to write software on a laptop that wheezed when it booted up. No one believed I'd last. I don't think I even did. But something about the quiet made it easier to hear myself think. I wasn't building a company yet. I was trying to build a reason to believe I hadn't lost everything for nothing. The loneliness was a different kind of burn. No holidays, no birthday calls, no family texts, unless it was to ask me to remove my name from a press mention. I was the black sheep, except they never called me that out loud. They just stopped calling at all. But deep down, I knew I hadn't walked away from something. I had walked towards something real, toward dirt and data and maybe finally something worth growing. I found the container behind an abandoned lumber yard outside Fort Morgan, Colorado. The roof leaked and the walls groaned at night when the wind pushed through the valley. But the rent was cheap and I could see the stars. I dragged in a mattress from Goodwill and stacked milk crates to make a desk. My laptop wheezed when I opened CAD files and the heat shut off if I ran the soldering iron too long. I worked in gloves and a knit hat even indoors. At night, I wrote code by flashlight. During the day, I tested circuits with scavenged wires and thrifted gear. Most days, I ate cold ramen straight from the package and drank black coffee like it was oxygen. The first prototype sparked smoked and died. I cried. Then I rewired it and tried again. I posted sketches and questions on niche engineering forums. Most replies were silence. One wasn't. Riley emailed me a week later, said she had worked on avionics systems for NASA but wanted to build something that mattered here on Earth. Her note ended with a question. Need someone else just crazy enough to believe this could work? She showed up 3 weeks later in a dusty Subaru with a duffel bag and a rice cooker. We built work tables from plywood and crates, shared a single space heater and hope. We tested the sensor in flower pots, old tomato beds, and sandboxes. We fried 2 motherboards and lost power more times than I could count. But the data started trickling in. Temperature, moisture, feedback loops, something real. We called it TerraSense, not a company, not yet, just a prototype with duct tape holding its future together. We pitched it to anyone who'd listen. At first, that meant farmers at gas stations and skeptical hardware store owners. One said we were cute but naive. I smiled and took his card anyway. We were broke, tired, undeniably stubborn, but we kept going. Sometimes Riley cooked rice and scrambled eggs when I forgot to eat for days. She once threatened to unplug the router if I didn't sleep. She became more than a partner. She was the first person who saw the future I was trying to build and didn't laugh. That winter, the container froze on the inside. Our breath hung like smoke, but the sensor worked in snow. That was enough. It wasn't a launch. It was a heartbeat. And for the first time, I didn't feel like a ghost in my own life. I felt like a builder, a grower. Something was taking root, and it had our names on it. We pitched to 17 investors in 2 months. Riley wore the same blazer each time, and I printed our slides at the public library because the container's Wi-Fi was too slow. Most meetings ended with polite nods and feedback that sounded supportive but meant no. One investor said farmers didn't use apps. Another told us we should pivot to a lawn care market. A third called our prototype rustic, which felt like a backhanded compliment. We kept going. Our 18th meeting was inside a borrowed storage unit that smelled like motor oil and sawdust. No projector, no glossy pitch deck, just 2 folding chairs, a beat-up sensor, and a woman named Elena, who had built her logistics firm out of a secondhand van and grit. She sat cross-legged in boots that had seen work, listened without interrupting, asked if the dashboard synced in real time, then leaned closer when the graph updated mid-demo. Her only questions were simple. Can it scale? Do you eat lunch? When I said yes and no, she laughed and wrote a $50 check on the spot. Said she liked betting on dirt. That money didn't buy luxury, it bought a little more time. We used it to run our first pilot on a farm west of Fort Morgan. The couple who owned it had almost sold the land, crop failures had buried them in debt, and their teenage daughter had already transferred schools twice. We installed 6 sensors and watched. Every morning, Riley checked moisture levels. I rewrote parts of the code in the middle of the night when alerts misfired. By month 2, the data turned. Targeted watering optimized soil input. It worked. That harvest came in 30% higher than expected. The farmer's wife hugged me behind the barn, her eyes filled as she whispered that her daughter could stay in school. I didn't know what to say. I just nodded and let the moment fill the silence we had worked through. Back at the container, Riley opened a pack of instant noodles and made tea. I stared at the wall where we had pinned every investor's name, crossed out 16, circled 1. It wasn't about the money. It was the first time someone believed in what we built without needing a translation. We slept better that night than we had in weeks. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was surviving something. I felt like I was building it, like maybe I hadn't made a mistake walking away from Yale. Maybe I had walked towards something bigger, and now I had proof. The envelope felt too formal for anything good. Cream-colored thick with the Taylor family crest pressed into the flap like a stamp of judgment. I found it wedged beneath a stack of invoices, its edges stiff with ceremony. Inside, the handwriting was unmistakable. My mother's cursive looped through each letter of my name, Emma Grace Taylor, like dressing it up could soften what it meant. The invitation was for the annual Taylor Foundation Gala. Same ballroom, same guest list, same air of quiet comparison. Riley stood behind me as I read it again. Her arms crossed, her brow furrowed. She didn't have to say it. I already knew. I sat with the letter for hours, not because I didn't know the answer, but because the emotions it stirred had no name. A cocktail of memory defiance and a strange sense of readiness. I wasn't going because I wanted to be welcomed. I was going because they needed to see me now. Not as the dropout, not as the black sheep, but as the woman who built something they never imagined. Riley watched me pack the morning of the flight. She tossed a pair of heels into the suitcase. I pulled them back out, told her I wasn't dressing for their approval. My outfit was simple, a dark brown dress the color of good soil, work boots scuffed but clean, no makeup, just the watch I wore in the container during our first frost. We flew into Richmond and drove toward the estate in a rental car that still smelled faintly of plastic. As we passed the old courthouse, I glanced at the statue of my great-grandfather, once a revered judge. I used to think I had to live up to that shadow. Now I only saw stone. The night before the gala, I stood by the hotel window and rehearsed nothing. No speech, no practiced smiles. I had spent too long trying to become someone they'd understand. This time, I'd just show up. Riley handed me a burner phone, said if anything went sideways, I could call and she'd be there in 5 minutes. I smiled but didn't answer. I didn't expect them to see me. I just needed them to know I was no longer invisible. I was returning not to be forgiven, but to be witnessed. And this time, I would not shrink. The gates were open, but it still felt like I was trespassing. The Taylor estate hadn't changed. The columns were as white as ever, the lawn trimmed like a courtroom brief, precise and silent. I stepped out of the rental car and adjusted my dress. It hung loose the way I liked it. My boots made soft thuds on the gravel, defiant against the click of heels I could already hear near the entrance. Inside, the air smelled like polished wood and catered approval. No one greeted me, not even the butler who used to sneak me chocolate when I came home from school. My mother stood by the fireplace in lavender silk. She glanced up, blinked, and looked away, like I was part of the decor someone forgot to dust. A cousin whispered something behind a champagne flute. I caught the word, Nebraska. The giggle that followed stung more than it should have. I walked past portraits of ancestors who'd signed land deeds and chaired federal committees. Their eyes followed me, still judging, but I didn't shrink. The library door was half open. I glanced inside, remembering the night I cried into a textbook, realizing I didn't want their world. That ache had long since turned to clarity. In the dining room, silver clinked against china. My father stood at the head of the table, delivering his usual opening toast. My name wasn't mentioned. I took the empty seat near the end. No one stopped me, but no one acknowledged me either. The air around me felt like static, familiar and cold. My sister Elizabeth lifted her glass to toast her engagement. Her fiancé flashed a politician's smile, all teeth and no warmth. They looked polished and permanent like museum pieces. The conversation rolled around me like I wasn't there. Someone asked about Daniel's new court appointment. Another cousin mentioned Harvard. The spotlight never flickered in my direction. I sat quietly, my fingers resting on the old watch I hadn't taken off since Colorado. It ticked steady, proof I still moved through time even when they refused to see me. They hadn't changed, and I didn't expect them to. But I had. The main course was duck confit with fig glaze plated like a magazine cover. Conversation hummed with the ease of people confident in their place. My brother's new appointment to the state bench was mentioned 3 times before the wine made its second lap around the table. When Elizabeth leaned into the candlelight to announce her upcoming wedding, a cheer went up. Her fiancé smiled with his whole mouth, but none of his eyes. He thanked the family for their support, especially her father, who had offered legal advice and arranged a venue through a mutual friend. Applause followed. Napkins dabbed lips. Silverware chimed against porcelain. I didn't say a word. The toast came next. My father stood slowly the way he did in court, his presence built to fill a room. He cleared his throat and lifted his glass, his voice firm. He celebrated Daniel's public service, Elizabeth's engagement, the enduring values of hard work and dignity. Legacy, he said. Tradition. The room clinked glasses on cue. Then he paused, looked in my direction but not at me. He said the family had made a decision, that while every family has its different paths, some no longer align with the principles of the Taylor legacy. For the sake of clarity and integrity, one name would be removed from all legal and inheritance structures going forward. My stomach tightened. I didn't move. No one asked who. They knew. He said my name, once deliberate, final. There were no gasps, just a quiet shift in the room's weight, like someone had turned the thermostat down by 5 degrees. Elizabeth stared at her dessert. Daniel looked pleased in that way only a sibling can be when the scales finally tip in their favor. My mother sipped her wine, her ring tapping once against the glass. I didn't flinch. My hand stayed folded on my lap, steady as dirt. The waiter cleared the plates. Dessert arrived in delicate portions, chocolate soufflé, art on a dish. I stared at mine, but didn't lift the fork. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket, once then twice. I excused myself quietly. No one stopped me. On the veranda, I answered. Riley's voice cut through the cold. The deal was signed. USDA and Walmart had both finalized. National rollout confirmed. Our valuation had tripled. Forbes wanted the cover in 48 hours. I stood there for a moment, the air sharp in my lungs. Then I walked back in. I took my seat, folded my napkin again, lifted my glass. I apologized for stepping away. Then I said I had just received confirmation that our startup had closed a national contract with 2 major partners, the kind that would feed communities, the kind that would fund change. No one spoke. My father set his glass down. My mother's fork slipped and tapped the plate. Elizabeth blinked twice and looked away. I let the silence stretch. Then I placed my napkin on the table and said that perhaps the real legacy is not what we inherit, but what we build when no one believes in us. Then I stood up and I left. 3 days after the dinner, the first headline dropped. Emma Taylor, daughter of federal judge and former Stanford scholar, wins USDA contract under scrutiny. The photo they used was old from a law conference I never attended, cropped to make me look smug. The article hinted at impropriety, suggested I had pulled strings, called the deal suspiciously favorable. I read it twice before Riley found me in the hallway and handed me her phone. More were coming. By the end of the week, a dozen outlets had picked it up. Anonymous sources, legal whispers, political influence. Words like nepotism and conflict of interest started to stick. I knew who leaked it before the proof arrived. Daniel had always played clean in public and brutal behind the scenes. His name showed up in metadata from a forwarded email. The contract draft, my signature, sent from his office to a journalist on background. I sat at my desk, my hands shaking, not from fear, from disbelief. Riley paced the floor, her jaw clenched. True Harvest's inbox flooded with interview requests. Farmers we worked with began getting calls. One investor paused funding. A few posted statements asking for transparency. Then came the lawsuit. A rival agritech firm claimed our technology was derivative, accused us of using insider access to steal government funds. I read the filing at 3 a.m., the legal terms familiar and sharp. I had once trained to be on the other side of these cases. Now I was the headline. The weight pressed in from every side. The momentum we had built over years felt suddenly fragile, like glass cracking beneath a boot. We had done everything right, filed every form, audited every grant, but facts didn't trend, scandal did. I didn't sleep that week, not because I was afraid to lose, but because it was him, my own brother, the same boy who used to help me find constellations in the backyard. Now he was out for blood. And yet, somewhere beneath the anger, a clarity surfaced. They couldn't take what I had built, they could only try to bury it. But I had spent my whole life growing things in hard soil, and I knew how to rise. We didn't hire a crisis PR firm, we didn't storm the media with sound bites or threats. Riley looked at me across the table and said, "If we fight them their way, we lose, even if we win." So we went another way. We started with the data, every sensor reading, every independent test. We pulled up time-stamped emails, invoice chains, third-party audits. It took 3 sleepless nights and a wall covered in spreadsheets and pins. Then we reached out to the farmers. Not just the ones who liked us, the ones who had doubted us at first, the ones who had nothing to gain by lying. They sent letters, photos, video clips of kids holding up fresh produce in fields that had once dried to dust. We built a page, quiet, no branding, no marketing spin, just the facts, just the voices that mattered. Then we sent it to every news outlet that had printed a headline. No press release, no spin, just this. Here's the truth. Do what you want with it. Most of them didn't respond, but one did. A small agricultural trade journal ran the story. No fluff, just numbers, quotes from farmers, and a closing paragraph that asked why no one had asked Emma Taylor to comment before accusing her. The USDA called 2 days later. The review board had examined the documentation. No breaches, no red flags, contract reinstated, case closed. No apology, but the silence that followed was louder than any retraction. I sat on the front steps of our new office when the email came through. Riley handed me a coffee still too hot to drink and said nothing. We both stared out at the street, the sound of traffic and life moving on. We hadn't won in a courtroom. We hadn't dragged names or burned bridges. We had just told the truth, and it had been enough. That night, I reread every testimonial, every voice that stood up for us when it would have been easier to stay quiet. I thought about the version of me who used to hide in the shadows of legacy, thinking silence was the only way to survive. But this was better. Not loud, not glamorous, but real. And that was all I ever wanted. The courthouse smelled like old books and stale coffee. The walls were lined with portraits of judges, most of them men who had ruled with voices like my father's. I sat behind the defendant's table, not as a student this time, but as someone finally ready to speak. Daniel sat across from me, polished as ever, his suit crisp, his smile rehearsed. He looked every bit the rising legal star, but beneath the calm, I saw the twitch in his hand when the judge called the room to order. He had filed a claim of professional misconduct, accused me of manipulating federal contracts through family ties and personal gain, claimed I'd used our family name to leverage access, and in doing so breached ethical codes and misled the public. The courtroom was packed, reporters scribbled, my parents sat stone-faced in the gallery, my mother didn't look at me. I took the stand on the 3rd day. My lawyer kept it simple, no theatrics, just the truth. I walked the court through every step, from the shipping container to the pilot farm, from rejection after rejection to our first check. I spoke slowly, clearly. I didn't raise my voice. I told them about Roy, the drought, the decision to walk away from law because I wanted to build something that saved lives, not just arguments. Daniel tried to rattle me on cross, pointed out I had access to contacts most startups could only dream of, implied I played the sympathy card well. Then my lawyer played the audio. It was a voicemail, a clipped message left on a mutual friend's phone. Daniel's voice, clear, cold. He laughed about leaking my contract, said he couldn't stand to see me win, that someone needed to knock me back down where I belonged. Silence filled the courtroom, a different kind this time. The judge's eyes didn't move. My lawyer rested his case. Daniel's face drained of color. No one clapped. This wasn't a movie, but I could feel the shift. Even the court reporter paused before typing again. The case was dismissed. Sanctions were filed against Daniel. He left the courtroom without a word. I stepped outside into the cold. Riley was waiting with a coffee in each hand. I took mine without speaking, just stared up at the sky. It wasn't triumph I felt, it was stillness. For once, I didn't have to prove I belonged. I had stood in the place they built to break people like me, and I hadn't bowed. Sometimes justice doesn't come with applause. It comes with breath, clean, quiet, free. The farm looked smaller than I remembered. The soil darker. The tree I used to sit under had grown wide enough to cast a real shadow. It had survived wind and winter, just like me. I came alone that morning before the ribbon cutting, before the speeches. I wore jeans and old flannel and boots that had known years of mud. In my coat pocket was my first notebook, the one with sketches and half-formed equations and notes scribbled during ramen dinners. I dug a small hole beneath the tree's roots. Not deep, just enough to tuck something away. I pressed the notebook into the earth and covered it gently with my palm. Riley said it was a little ceremony. I said it was closure. The gala we skipped had been replaced with our own gathering. Schoolgirls from across the region, each holding clipboards and sensors, toured the fields in groups. Their questions filled the air like music. We had partnered with 3 state programs, brought ag tech into public schools, built gardens on campuses. Some of the girls wore hijabs, others wore denim jackets with pins. They all looked curious, brave, capable. I stood with them in the dirt, showed them how to read moisture levels and troubleshoot alerts. One girl asked if I ever got scared running a company. I told her every day, but that fear and failure are different. One tells you to run, the other teaches you how to stay. Later that afternoon, my mother appeared. No announcement, no fanfare. She wore soft shoes and carried a scarf folded neatly in her hands. Her hair had thinned. Her voice when it came was smaller than I remembered. She said she'd seen the news, said she was sorry she didn't understand before. Then she asked if she could stay for the tour. I nodded. We didn't hug, but we stood side by side for 10 minutes under a tree we both remembered. That was enough. True Harvest kept growing. The lawsuits faded. The headlines changed. But what mattered most was quieter. The classroom kits, the farmer co-ops, the sense that we were feeding more than crops. And me, I stopped needing them to see me. Because I finally saw myself. Not through the eyes of a courtroom, not through the lens of legacy, but through roots, real ones, grown from a choice I made a long time ago. Healing didn't come with an apology. It came with breath, with soil, with staying.